OH. All right. So most of you know Jack Park is an entertaining football commentator on Sports Radio 97.1 The Fan. And you may have even seen him on ESPN, Big Ten Network, or Fox Sports. And you may also know him as an author for Ohio State football books, including Ohio State University Football Vault and the official Ohio State Football Encyclopedia. But many of you might not know that Jack is also a CPA and a nationally recognized presenter who's delivered his award-winning leadership development program called The Leadership Secrets of Football's Master Coaches to corporations and associations in 47 states. Pretty amazing. What are the three?
Well, the last three are South Dakota, Wyoming, and
North Dakota. All right.
Many clients in those three states.
Yeah, I can understand. All right, so please help me welcome a warm Rotary welcome to Jack Park.
Well, hello, everybody. My pleasure to be with you, particularly this time of the year. And I thought driving down here, I remember the first time I had the real privilege of speaking before the Columbus Rotary Club. It was about 25 years ago, I'm going to guess. And a good friend of mine invited me to be the speaker and introduced me that day, and that was Dean Duggar. And how many remember Dean, of course? Dean was an All-American end on, I would say, maybe the greatest Ohio State football team of all time, certainly one of them, and that was the 1954 national champions. And I say it's the greatest of all time because they probably had the toughest schedule of any Ohio State team in history. The seasons were much shorter, only 10 games that included the Rose Bowl. But that year in particular, a big win over Wisconsin, who had Alan Amici that would win the Heisman Trophy that year. Wisconsin was number 2, and Ohio State was number 4. And we won the game 31-14. And the game was far, far closer than the score indicated. In fact, Wisconsin was still ahead late in the third quarter. And Dean Duggar's, probably his greatest game was going through, and his greatest game as a Buckeye, I think. It might be that game that helped him become an All-American that year. And he sacked, spilled, you might say, Alan Amici behind the line of scrimmage 4 times in the fourth quarter of that game. And that was a real big step going on to winning a national title. Of course, the Michigan game that year was one of the great Michigan games of all time. And some of you know this, and some of you may not know. Dean had a brother, Jack Duggar, who was 10 years younger. And this is one of the great chapters, I think, in Ohio State football history. Jack Duggar was an All-American in 1944, and he was an All-American, and Ohio State was undefeated that year. They had a perfect season, and they won the National Civilian Championship. Dean, of course, was 10 years younger, was an All-American in 54, as we said. They won the national title, undefeated with a perfect record in 1954. So there you have brothers, 10 years apart. They each play the same position. They're each All-Americans, and they each play on national championship teams at the Ohio State University. So those don't come along too long. But Dean was a good friend and really a great guy, a real funny guy, had a real sense of humor. So I just thought a lot about him as I was driving down here today. Let's get started. Who was the first opponent to defeat Ohio State twice during the same season? Who first beat Ohio State twice in the same season? And by the way, we haven't played anybody twice in the same season since 1975. And that was UCLA, and it was 1-1, and that loss there was bad because that cost us the national title. Who is it? Anybody know? How about if we've been playing 126 years of football now? What if I identified the season? That would probably make it a lot easier. Wouldn't that make it a lot easier, Ed, if we identified the year? Okay, yeah, I agree it would be. So let me identify the year for us. Who? No, but that's really a good guess. University of Chicago was one of the founding members of the Big Ten, but we never played them twice in the same season. But once we joined the Big Ten, we probably played them pretty much every year. But that's a good guess, but it was not Chicago. Somebody said, not Ohio Wesleyan. Somebody said Oberlin. Very good, very good. Do you remember what the scores were? Not that you were there, but I thought maybe you studied about it. No, I wasn't there either. A lot of people think I was. I wasn't there either. Well, these are the scores, and I'm going to put these up on the screen, and believe me, these are accurate. I'm not making this up. Hey, it's worse than it looks. Do you know how much touchdowns are worth in 1892? 4 points. They later became 5, and they later became 6 points. Now, here's the question. Who was Oberlin's head coach in 1892? Who knows? Not Newt Rockne, but you're in the ballpark, and we're going to talk about Newt Rockne here in just a minute. Who was Oberlin's coach? Let me give you a little hint. He grew up in Cleveland, Ohio. He was 23 years old. This is the very first coaching job he'll ever have. And that 40-0 win in the first game was the opening game for both teams. And then Oberlin, and that was at Oberlin. And Oberlin comes to Columbus later in the season and beats us 50-0. So who was Oberlin's head coach, new coach, and that 40-0 win over Ohio State was the very first game in his coaching career. And his name was John W. Heisman, for whom the Heisman Trophy is named. So if you got some friends that think they know everything about football, ask them. Ask them against whom Ohio State, John W. Heisman coached his first game. Now, here's the question. Who was Ohio State's head coach in 1892? You may not know, and not too many people will. His name was Jack Ryder. But here's an interesting question to go along with that. One of his assistants was, can you identify that gentleman there? He was an assistant coach in 1892, pretty famous guy before he would pass away around 1944. He became quite a good guy here in the city of Columbus, and his name was Samuel P. Bush. Of course, he would have a grandfather, a grandson, a great-grandson, and so forth, go on to become president, founder of Buckeye Steel. But Sam Bush was laid out, helped lay out, as I understand it, Scioto Country Club golf course and everything. Now, here's the question. What was Oberlin's final record in 1892? Do you know? What was the final record? No? Not quite, but not too bad, not too bad. Well, you know they won 2 games, right? You know they won at least 2. What was Oberlin's record depends upon who you speak with. Okay? Let's go to the last game of the season for Oberlin. They're going to go to the University of Michigan. They can play with anybody in the country. Touchdowns are 4 points, as we said. The game's on the 19th of November, the same date that we're going to play up at Michigan State this year, for that matter. Now, as this game is about ready to start, John Heisman walks across the field and approaches Michigan coach Frank Barber. He says, Coach Barber, I have a request. This game should be over long before 4:45. But if it's not, if it really is a long game, I'd like you and I to reach an agreement that we will stop this game at 4:45, and whoever's ahead will be declared the winner. And Barber says, no, we're not going to do that. I mean, it shouldn't go that long at all, but if it does go that long, we're just going to play out the game. Well, Heisman says, bear with me if you would, please. You know, this football is fairly new up at Oberlin College, and Oberlin College has been founded on very, very sound Christian principles, and the administration at Oberlin is not too sure they want us to maintain a football program at this school. And they're thinking about doing away with our program. And if we don't leave this playing field by 4:45 tonight, we probably will miss the last train from Ann Arbor back into Oberlin tonight. And if we miss that train, we'll not be there for the required Sunday school classes tomorrow morning, and that's just another reason they'll probably want to get rid of the football program. Well, this time Barber says, okay, we'll stop at 4:45, but the game should be over long before that. Well, let's go to late in the fourth quarter. And the score is Michigan 22, Oberlin 20. Now keep in mind, touchdowns are 4 points, extra points are 2. Oberlin will drive the length of the field and score a touchdown. They will miss the extra point, but they'll be up 24-22. Oberlin kicks off to Michigan. Michigan is about ready to run its first play from scrimmage, and here comes John Heisman out on the field, and he says, guess what, guys? It's 4:45. We got to quit. And Frank Barber looked at his watch, and he said, no, it's 4:42. We still have 3 minutes to play. Apparently, they had not synchronized their watches. And Heisman said, no, it's 4:45, and we got to get out of here. We don't dare miss that train. And with that, he signaled the Oberlin team off the field, and they took off to the Ann Arbor train station. Frank Barber turned to his team. He's very disgusted. He's very upset, and he says, you know, that's not right. A deal's a deal. They said we'd play till 4:45. They can leave if they want to, but guess what, guys? We're going to play until 4:45. And they did. Now, can you picture this, a University of Michigan team on the field with no opposition? Well, let me tell you that, a Michigan team with no opposition can really run that ball in a hurry. And according to Michigan, they went right down there and scored a touchdown quickly. In fact, it only took them 3 plays to do that. Those guys at Michigan, they're good. Now, according to Frank Barber, the score is 26-24. Barber again looks at his watch. He says, it's 4:45. We don't have to kick off. The game is over. How was this ever resolved? Anybody know? Well, to this day, it has still never been resolved. If you go to the press guides today for Oberlin College, which is now Oberlin University, and the University of Michigan, that's 1892, that's what, 124 years ago? After 124 years, Michigan still claims victory in that game, and Oberlin still claims victory in that game. So I'll go back to my original question. What was Oberlin's final score, record that year? It all depends on who you talk with, basically. And I think the moral of the story is, if John W. Heisman was with us right here today at this luncheon, he'd look out and he'd say, hey, Buckeye fans, you know what? I could have told you way back in 1892 that you can't trust those guys from the University of Michigan. And by the way, that is a true story. It is a true story. I've been asked, that's a funny story. It's not really true, is it? It is a true story. Let's look around Ohio a little bit and see some things that have happened. How many Notre Dame fans do we have with us today? Okay, pretty good, pretty good. You're having a little bit of a tough season. I actually picked Notre Dame for one of the top 4 on my first radio program this year, so they don't ask me to predict anymore, that type of thing. But Notre Dame's having a tough year, but I think they may come back a little bit. But what goes around comes around, as we say, and certainly that happens in life. So for anybody, and particularly our Notre Dame fans with us today, 1918 is the year Knute Rockne, and somebody mentioned Knute Rockne here, Knute Rockne became head coach at Notre Dame. Now, he became head coach in 1918. Who was Knute Rockne's season opening opponent? Where was the game played, and what was the final score? Do you have any idea? No. No, okay. Who was Notre Dame's season opening opponent? Where was the game played, and what was the final score? Who knows? Anybody know? Van Horn Field at Carnegie Institute of Technology in Cleveland was the site of Knute Rockne's very first game. That's long before Case Institute and Western Reserve merged to form Case Western. And the date was the 26th of October, 1918. Notre Dame won the game 26-6. So, Knute Rockne's first game in the state of Ohio in Cleveland. And by the way, not too far from where hopefully we're going to win a World Series tomorrow night, and if not tomorrow night, certainly by Wednesday night. There is Van Horn Field as it is today. And it was so interesting, I got a hold of this story almost by accident, and I stopped the last time I spoke in South Bend and went through the library out there in Notre Dame, and I called the sports information director at Case, and I said, hey, I don't know if you're aware of this, you probably are, but you know, Knute Rockne coached his very first game on your campus, and he's probably a 35-year-old kid. I would say he's a kid. He didn't know that. What a nice young man. And so we went up, and he showed me where Van Horn Field was. It was on that field that Rockne coached his very first game. Now, we're just starting on this story, because what basically would happen that afternoon, I think, is extremely interesting looking back today. Here's the questions. Who scored Notre Dame's second and third touchdowns that afternoon? Now, somebody I'll bet can guess this one. George Gipp, absolutely. They're very good. George Gipp scored the second and third touchdowns. Now, who scored Notre Dame's first touchdown? Gipp was the left halfback. He scored number 2 and 3. The fullback scored the very first touchdown for a Knute Rockne coach team at Notre Dame, which was on the 26th of September of 1918 in Cleveland, Ohio. And that fullback was a guy by the name of Curly Lambeau. Now, let's take a little look. There's the 1918 team in the back row there. There's Knute Rockne on the left. Third, two over from him with the curly hair there is Curly Lambeau, and standing next to him is George Gipp. Now, as we say, what goes around comes around. After Notre Dame, Curly Lambeau would go back to Green Bay. As many of you know the story. He took a job with the Indian Packing Company, and about a year later, he persuaded the ownership of the Indian Packing Company, which later became known as the Acme Packers. He convinced them to appropriate $125, and some people say it was more than that, and some people say it was $500, but a very small sum of money, although it was probably much larger back in those days, to appropriate that so the Packers could what? Organize a semi-professional football team, and that money would use to buy uniforms and equipment, and they could start playing games with the other semi-pro teams in the state of Wisconsin. Well, of course, Curly was pretty successful with that, and he died in 1965, but his team still plays today, of course. You may saw them. They had a tough loss yesterday, a one-point loss, and, of course, that team today is still the Green Bay Packers. Curly's a pretty ambitious guy. He also coaches Green Bay South High School, okay? And there's a halfback on that team that is really, really, really good. And let's move ahead here. There's Curly Lambeau with the Acme Packers. In 1924, that halfback helped Green Bay South win the state championship of Wisconsin when Curly's coaching both them and the Packers. He helps Newt Rockne recruit that halfback to go to Notre Dame. He'll show up there in the fall of 1921, and the 1924 season will be his senior year. And that young man will end up being the left halfback in probably the most glorified backfield of all time. His name, of course, is Jim Crowley, and he will become the left halfback in that perfect season that they had in 1924 with the Four Horsemen. By the way, two of those other backs were from the state of Ohio. Harry Struelder was from Massillon, Ohio, and Don Miller was later became quite a well-known judge and everything up in the city of Cleveland. He was the right halfback, and Elmer Layden was the fullback out of Dubuque, Iowa. Those are the four Horsemen. Now let's move ahead. We're looking about what goes around comes around. We've had Rockne have Lambeau score his first touchdown. We've had Lambeau go back to Green Bay. We've had Lambeau coach a guy by the name of Jim Crowley, and Jim Crowley become a very, very famous football player at Notre Dame, and now be influenced by Rockne, and probably back a little bit by Lambeau before that, to do what? Go into coaching himself. And so he decides to go into coaching, and he'll start out as an assistant coach at the University of Georgia. In 1928, he will become head coach at Michigan State, have a good record there. And this shows a little bit how things have really changed over the last, almost not quite 100 years, but let's say the last 80 years in terms of where the big jobs are. Jim Crowley will leave Michigan State and take the head coaching job at Fordham University because it's a much better job. And he'll have great teams there. In fact, he'll come within a tie 2 years with the University of Pittsburgh, 2 consecutive ties, scoreless ties, of winning the national championship. He'll develop some of the greatest offensive teams of all time and greatest offensive lines of all time that become known as what? The 7 blocks of granite. Now, some of you know where this story's headed, I'm sure. Who was the right guard on the 7 blocks of granite in 1934, 35, and 36? Vince Lombardi. And there he is. He's the right guard there. Lombardi, as we all know, will also eventually get into coaching, but not by choice to start with. Lombardi's a business administration major, and he really can't get a job when he graduates in 1936 because of the Great Depression. And just to have something to do, he was offered a high school assistant coaching job at St. Cecilia High School right across the Hudson River there in Englewood, New Jersey. And, of course, the rest is history. He'll fall in love with this profession. It'll take him, though, 20 years to eventually get a head coaching job. He'll be turned down for head coaching positions 22 times. And we talk about persistence as being one of the real characteristics that we need to succeed. How many of us would have done that for 20 years? And that's those 22 jobs he was turned down for, those are just the ones that we know about. I'll bet there were a lot more. But, of course, what will happen here, there he is. He's St. Cecilia High School. He's going to be an assistant for them. He's going to serve under Red Blake at Army. He'll be with the New York Giants. And in 1959, Vince Lombardi will take the head coaching position at Green Bay of the Green Bay Packers, which at that time were the laughingstock of the league. And no question about it, they were. And, of course, he would transform that team tremendously, and they would become, of course, the team to win the first 2 Super Bowls. And of course, as we all know, the Super Bowl trophy today is called the Vince Lombardi Trophy. So there's a thing in life, what goes around comes around. Who would have ever thought that that could all be put together there? And that one took basically, when he will retire in the spring of 1968, that will be 50 years from when Rockne coached his very first game in Cleveland against Case-Tech in 1918. So sometimes you have to be patient and persistent, I guess, don't you, to have all that come about. Now, and bring that Super Bowl that we talked about, the first 2 Super Bowls, back to their Ohio roots. First of all, is there anybody who can identify that building?
Of course, it's the Frank Tebow Federal Building.
Yes, right, it is. Now, where is it located? Where is it located?
Way to go, Scott.
Hey, who knows where it's located? It's on Cleveland and 2nd Avenue, exactly in what city? That is in Canton, Ohio, and at that corner in 1920, there was a car dealership that belonged to the Hay family, and basically it was in the auto showroom, the first level of that building. That 11 people got together to form what we now know today, and what we knew right at that time as the National Football League. And George Howells was the leader. Everything that gets started needs a leader. Now that happened in 1920 on the 17th of September. Can you identify this location? Where? Yeah, no, but it's in that neighborhood. Anybody from Montgomery County with us here? That's Triangle Park in Dayton, Ohio. Now, you may or may not know this, but the first ever NFL game ever played was played in Dayton, Ohio. And it was between our team in Columbus here, the Panhandles, and the Dayton Triangles. And the score was 14-0 in favor of Dayton, and it was played on the 3rd of October of 1920. That's point number 2. Now, the third and final point, can you identify this building? Now, take a close look. I'll bet somebody here certainly can identify that building. Yep, absolutely. 16 East Broad, commonly known as the Hayden Building at 16 East Broad. In terms of football, what is significant about that building? Exactly. Who said that, please? Raise your hand. Thank you very much, very much. Steve, how are you? I haven't seen you for a long time. I might have known you'd know that. Steve used to coach our son in soccer. How many years ago was that? A few years ago. Well, that's it. That was the first office of the National Football League. And it was on the 11th floor, just 2 offices. A guy by the name of who? Joe Carr was the first president of the National Football League. He was a sports writer here in Columbus. He did a lot of different things. He ran the National Football League from 1920 through 1926 from his home. And by that time, they needed an office. There's 3 people, and they occupy that 11th floor, and that's the first ever office of the National Football League. I am obviously not a person of influence. I've tried and tried with different officials to get a historic sign put in front of that building. Don't you think there should be one? Everybody agrees they'll put one there, but nobody wants to come up with the money. I was even told, we'll do it, Jack, if you'll pay for it. So I didn't follow through on that a little bit there, but you'll see those signs in Dayton and Canton, but I think we need one here in Columbus. I think that's very significant. And of course, there's an old picture there that shows that from somewhere back about 1928. Who was the only football coach to win his first 5 games against Michigan? Now, you know where this is leading up to, too, don't you? I hope, about 26 days from today. Well, this guy, some of you will remember the name, or study the name, it's Red Blake. When he was head coach at Army, and there's 2 of the greatest players of all time, of course. There's Mr. Inside and Mr. Outside, Glenn Davis and of course, Doc Blanchard. And in 1954, Blake won his 5th game against Michigan, his 5th consecutive game. Nobody had ever done that before. Nobody has done that since. Now, wins over Michigan, 7 straight. Cornell, but they didn't have a head coach that was the same for more than about 1 or 2 years. I mean, they just had very informal coaches. Bernie Bierman at Minnesota won 8 straight, but not his first or second. Jack Molenkoff won 5 straight, but he lost his first one. And of course, this man here won 9 out of 10, including 7 in a row, but he did lose his 3rd one. So nobody except Red Blake has won his first 5 games over the University of Michigan. Can you identify the connection with Ohio State? That's obviously a very loaded question, certainly for this audience. Francis Schmidt won 4 in a row in 1934 through 37. In fact, they were all shutouts by a combined score of 114-0. But he lost in 1938. Now, you know where this is headed. Urban has won 4. And of course, a win this year in 2016, he will become the second coach to win his first 5 games against Michigan. Today just happens to be Nick Saban's 65th birthday. I'm not an Alabama fan, but hey, Nick, coached here at one time. He was an assistant earl, born in Fairmont, West Virginia, 65 years ago today. Anybody know where he graduated from? Kent State. And if you interview Nick, he can get pretty sentimental if you ask him a little bit about his freshman year. He was on the campus at Kent State when those 4 young people were killed back in May of 1970. He's 65 years old today. Now, that's his record through last Saturday, which they didn't play last Saturday, so technically it's his record through the Saturday before when they beat Texas A&M so badly. Often it's said in football circles today that the 2 greatest coaches in this country today in major college football are Nick Saban and who else? Urban Meyer. Well, I just knew you would say that. So there's Urban's record through last Saturday with that fairly narrow win over with Northwestern, which was a pretty good football team. It was a little bit, smaller, larger in a victory than we thought it might be, but it was a good win. Now, for every 100 games, let's go back here, Urban's rate is 82.5. What does that all mean? For every 100 games coached by Meyer and Saban, Meyer wins 8 more games than Saban. Now, if they'd only been coaching 2 or 3 or 4 years, but Nick's been a head coach now 21 seasons. He was at Toledo a year. He was at Michigan State. He was at LSU. And now, of course, he's at Alabama. Of course, Urban's a couple of years at Bowling Green, Utah, 5 years at Florida, was out 1 year, and now this is his 5th year at Ohio State. So he's been coaching 16 years. You get that much history behind each of the 2 of you. Urban's only 52, while Nick is 65. But over 100 games, if you win 8 more than the other guy, I think that's significant. I'm not biased at all, do you think? No, not biased at all. And I love to show this around a little bit there. And I always say to business people, if you're going to make a choice, wouldn't you like to have that product that has an 8% greater gross margin percentage? I think I would. 8%, 8 out of 100. Urban obviously over Nick. And also, we had some sad news. I remember I got a call at home yesterday morning that John Hicks had passed away. A lot of you may have known John. I was what I would say a very, very close acquaintance of John, so forth. Would probably see him, work with him 3 or 4 different times a year on charity events. I remember the first time was, I'm going to guess it was probably 12, 13, 14 years ago. Some of you may have been there, but it was he was so close with Jack Tatum. And Jack, of course, came down with diabetes and needed some help. And John put a big fundraiser together. We held it at the Buckeye Hall of Fame Cafe, as it was at that time. I remember I was honored. I was one of the speakers there. We had other people come in. Earl was there. Earl came back to do that and so forth. And a lot of the players, we did tons of autographs there with a lot of very prominent people there. Jim Stillwagon, I remember just all the people were there to help raise money for Jack Tatum. And that was all organized by John Hicks. And over these last years, John became the go-to guy, not very well known maybe by a lot of people, but John Hicks truly became the go-to guy when there was a former Ohio State football player that needed some assistance for whatever reasons. They needed some assistance. And John would always, he had the connections, and he had his ups and downs in his own business too, for that matter. And but John would always come through, and he'd done so much. There's you're probably familiar with one of the charity events is the Unverfurth House. It'll be again this year, I think on the 22nd, to raise money in honor of Don Unverfurth for the apartment buildings there close to University Hospital for people that are coming in, family people that need a place to stay while they have a loved one or a relative, and probably both, of course, having an operation or under conditioning at Ohio State. And John's the guy that organized that on behalf of Don Underfurth. And they, you know, I'm sure that in later life they knew each other, but Don's last season as a quarterback was 1965, and John Hicks didn't graduate from high school until 1969. So there was no football playing connection there, but there was a tremendous love and everything like that. So we've lost a great soldier, and he's only 65 years old. And it is a loss. There's no question about it. I have not seen John. I remember the last time I saw him. I remember I had a long talk yesterday with a couple people, and it was probably a year ago when I saw John last. And that was, I spoke last year at that Underfurth fundraiser, and John was there. He was in a wheelchair, and we all knew that, you know, he was going through some tough times himself at that time there. So passing away, the last lineman to finish second in the Heisman Trophy voting. There's never been an offensive lineman since that finished second in the Heisman Trophy voting. That was 1973, John Capoletti was the winner from Penn State. That's long before Penn State, 20 years before Penn State came into the Big Ten. But also that year, John was second in the Heisman, but he also won the Lombardi Award, and he won the Outland Trophy, too, as a kind of a triple play, as you might say. He's the first lineman to start 3 Rose Bowls. And somebody was kidding here at the front table, and somebody told Archie Griffin, you would just have been another back if it had been for John Hicks. Somebody said that. Who was it said that? Something like that. So that's probably not true, but I don't think it hurt John at all. And, you know, you can look at the 2 offensive tackles that we had here in 1968, Dave Foley and Rufus Mays. They were both All-Americans. Was that the greatest offensive tackle pair of all time? It might have been. Mashinsky and Helinski weren't bad in 1954. But if you look at the 1973 Ohio State football team with John Hicks and the other guy that never probably, I think, should have gotten the right recognition he should have, and that was Kurt Schumacher. How many remember Kurt Schumacher? A tremendous offensive tackle. And, you know, you put those 2 guys at the offensive tackles, and then put Archie and Pete Johnson and some of those other guys, even Brian Beischnuggle might get a carry once in a while. It was really a great era there. So a great guy, and we're very, very fortunate to have him at Ohio State. I remember John told me the assistant coach that came up to his family in Cleveland to recruit him was Lou Holtz. And that would have been in 1968. Lou was, of course, his backfield coach here in 68. John graduated from high school in 1969. And he said, you know, Holtz was just really talking and all this, and he brought a projector with him and all this stuff. And John said when Holtz left the house, his parents turned to John and said, who was that guy? You know, like this Lou Holtz. He made a pressure on the family there. Take a couple questions if we have them, Jack.
Where was that 1892 game played? Was it down in German Village?
German Village, yeah. Where the Giant Eagle is now there? Yes, that's where it was played. They were played there, and then they played some up at, what's the park there on the north side of the north? Not the Park of Roses, but downtown here. Goodale Park. Some games were played at Goodale Park off and on. But the original athletic field was where the James Cancer Hospital is today, at 11th and Neal, and pretty soon they started playing games there, and then in 1898 they were moved up to Woodruff and High Street, and that field that was first named University Field and then later named Ohio Field from until 1921, and then moving into the stadium. But that was I've always understood there was a ballpark down in German Village there that was a minor league ballpark. It was a baseball park, really, but that's where Ohio State played its first games and played its very first game, the first home game after losing to Oberlin 40-0. The first home game was here in Columbus against Worcester, and Worcester beat Ohio State 64-0. Worcester has always claimed that's the only time you've played us. You're scared. You're still scared to play us. You know, we beat you 64-0. Probably not true. Yes, Ed.
Jack, could you speak to the present team and their experience and how you see that happening, how they're playing?
Today's team? Yeah, this is the youngest team in major college football with respect to the amount of playing experience for the whole team. And not only the 6 starters, but we've got a lot of kids, much like Michael Jordan. That's a true freshman. Not that they hadn't been a starter before, they hadn't even played before. And so it's a very, very young team. It's one of the most talented teams I think we probably will ever have. And we'll find out with the rest of this year and certainly in the years ahead. I do think a little bit, this is my opinion, and probably the opinion of a lot of other people, that in the last couple of weeks that youth has started to show a little bit. and we certainly got some things to work on. I would say the thing we need to work on most is our receivers getting open, basically, is really get clearance on the receivers. And that seemed to happen in the first 3 or 4 games, so maybe we're playing better opposition right now, I don't know. But I think JT's having a hard time finding open receivers, and hopefully that'll all come together. And Jack, everybody, thank you very much for the opportunity to be with you here. Go Bucks!
And this meeting is adjourned. Thank you.